Okay. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, everyone. I want to dedicate the shiur today to the memory of a very special person who passed away over Shabbat. And I'm going to show you a picture of him now. There you go. Rabbi Dr. Shalom Coleman, pictured there with my son Dan in Perth Hebrew congregation. Dr. Shalom Coleman passed away at the age of 106 yesterday. He was born in Liverpool and went to Australia as a fairly young man. Was in Sydney, I think, originally. And then was the rabbi of Perth Hebrew congregation for many years. And he was an amazing person. We were there in February for my grandson's bar mitzvah. Got some fabulous photographs of him with the bar mitzvah boy. He was still going to shul 3 times a day at that stage. He was still driving and still giving a shiur every week. Quite remarkable man. He passed away over the weekend after a short illness, and he'll be greatly missed. So we'll dedicate the shiur to his memory. Rabbi Dr. Shalom Coleman, CBE AM. AM is the Australian medal, perhaps. Anyway, I think it's one of the highest honors that an Australian can get. So he was a very special guy. So that's Rabbi Coleman. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Right, we are in Shmuel Bet, and I've got to the stage where David has now been anointed as king over all of Israel. And we're going to learn now over the next few chapters of his various different exploits. But in this chapter, last week we spoke about the conquest of Jerusalem. Just briefly, and we're going to talk about the conquest of Jerusalem in a little bit more detail this week, because there's some very strange business going on here, which we need to get to the bottom of. So let's get the text on the screen. There we go. And perhaps we'll go right from the top. No, we don't need to go from the top. Let's go from verse 6. There we go. Jeffrey, verse 6, please, and onwards. I'll stop you when we need to stop.
The king and his men went to Jerusalem, to the Jebusite inhabitants of the land, and one of them spoke to David, saying, "You shall not enter here unless you remove the blind and the lame," as if to say, David will not enter here.
Stop there. That's a very odd pasuk, that. It seems that the first thing that David did when he was anointed as king over Israel was to try and conquer Jerusalem. He was king before that. We look at verse 5. Jeffrey, verse 5 for us, please.
In Hebron, he ruled over Judah for 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he ruled for 33 years over all of Israel and Judah.
So previously he was the king in Hebron. He was the leader of Yehuda in Hebron. The first thing he did was to capture Jerusalem. And we spoke about this towards the end of last week's shiur. When we looked at the map. Let's just look at a map here of the area. Let's just get it up on this. There we go. Make it a bit bigger. So you can see over here in this map, there's Jerusalem and there's Hebron. You see that? There's Jerusalem, there's Hebron. Now, we spoke about this last week. Hebron is bang in the middle of Yehuda territory. Okay, let's just have a look if we can, and go to the our favorite map there that Johnny's got on the screen for us. Let me see if I can just get it up on the screen. Got it on my desktop. Let me just get that up. See if I can find it. 1 second. Desktop. Here we go.
12 tribes of Israel chart. The 12 tribes of Israel chart, it says.
Yeah, I've got it on my desktop as something else. Can't find it really. Doesn't matter. Right. Anyway, just hold it up for us, Johnny, by your camera. Right. Okay. So you can see on Johnny's map there, Judah is there. Hebron is right in the middle of the territory of Judah. Jerusalem is on the border. Thank you, Johnny. Is on the border of Binyamin territory and Yehuda territory. And so what you've got is a move by David to solidify his kingdom by making Jerusalem his capital. He's moving from Hebron, which is pure Yehuda territory, into Jerusalem, which is on the border of Yehuda and Binyamin territory. Binyamin being, we spoke about this right at the end of the last week's shiur, Binyamin being at that time the main tribe of Israel, as opposed to Judah, because, of course, King Shaul, Ishbosheth, Jonathan were all from the tribe of Binyamin. So it was important that he got a capital which was in the right place. So if we go back to the text, he came up to Jerusalem, and then this funny thing comes on. The men of Yerushalayim, of Yevus, that's the Yevusim, they were the people that were there at the time. And they said to him, "You will not come here unless you remove the blind and the lame." As if to say, David shall not come here. What's all that talking about? Blind and the lame. We don't know right now. Let's just go on a bit, and it might become clear. Verse 7.
David then captured Zion fortress, which is called the City of David. David declared on that day, "Whoever smites the Jebusite and reaches the stronghold and the blind and the lame, that David detests." And therefore, people say, "The blind and the lame are here. He shall not enter the house." David settled in the fortress and called it the City of David. David built around the city from the Millo and inward.
Okay, stop there. Okay, so I'm interested in this blind and the lame. What is it talking about? And what does verse 8 mean? It makes no sense at all the way you read it, David, Jeffrey. It makes a little bit more sense on the screen, but not much. So let's just break these 3 psukim down. And has anybody any idea what they're talking about here with the blind and the lame? Michael Krauss has no idea whatsoever. Yes, Johnny.
I'm only telling what Rabbi Steinsaltz says, the Yevusite idols.
Okay, that is one opinion, and we'll come back to that in some detail in a minute.
That's Rabbi Steinsaltz, not me.
On the face of it, this is weird, right? What is it talking about? Let's just break down the psukim a bit carefully and see if we can make some sense out of it. The king and his men went to Yerushalayim, And what does it mean they went there? Well, presumably they went there to try and negotiate a takeover. And they spoke to David saying, no, we're not interested. You'll not come here unless you remove ki im hesircha ha'ivrim va ha'pischim. You will not come here unless you remove the blind and the lame. Lemor, saying, in other words, what we mean is, lo yavo David heina, you're not coming in here. We're not interested. Go away. But he didn't go away, and he conquered Mitzudat Tzion, the stronghold of Zion. He Ir David. That is Ir David. Who's been to Ir David? Yeah. I went fairly recently. I went in January of this year when my bar mitzvah boy was here. We went on a tour, and we went to Ir David. Those of you who've been to Ir David will know where it is. You come out of the Shar HaAshpa, you come out of the dung gate right by the Kotel, and you turn left and go down the hill for about, 100 yards, and you turn right into a little street, and there is the entrance to Ir David. And you go in there, and it's a whole area there, but it's been excavated a lot in recent years. And you go in there, and you can go all the way down to the pool of Siloam, Brechat HaShiluach, which is the huge pool of water there. From where you can go into the tunnels, Chizkiyahu's tunnels, which connected the Gihon spring to the Brechat Shiluach. Now, the Gihon spring was the most important part of this whole thing, because in ancient times and modern times as well, of course, the main thing that made sure and cemented a city's success was what?
Water supply.
Water supply. You don't have a water supply, you're finished. So the Gihon spring was a natural spring, which is in the southwest of Jerusalem. Let's just show you where it is. The Gihon spring is over there. Here's Ir David. Okay. Here's Ir David. And the Gihon spring is over here. Right? And that was the water supply for Ir David and for the city of Jerusalem.
There
it is. There it is. I've got it there. There it is. Can you see it there? The Gihon spring. Gihon spring. Can you see that?
Detailed map, Rabbi Steinsaltz, of what you're talking about.
Right. So there's the Gihon spring. Here is the Chizkiyahu's tunnel, which some of you may have been through. And this takes you all the way to
one tunnel.
What? Two tunnels, Chizkiyahu's tunnel and the Shiluach tunnel. This Chizkiyahu's tunnel is a sort of a wandering tunnel, as if it's much more curved. The Shiluach tunnel is a straightforward tunnel, and it takes you to the Shiluach, takes you to this Brechat Shiluach, which was the place where the water supply was. This was the massive mikveh, basically. Anybody going up to, in later times, anybody going up to the Beit HaMikdash came here in Ir David, the bottom of Ir David, came to the mikveh and then went up the road. Now they're just excavating now. Just now they're excavating the road from the Shiluach all the way up to Har Habayit, and they've excavated like the first couple of 100 yards, and you're able to go up and see. It's absolutely brilliant. They've not finished it yet, and it won't be finished for a while. But this was completely new since the last time I was there, and it was absolutely fascinating. And it's you can picture this idea of everyone coming to who's going to be Ola Regel. They went to this massive mikveh, which you can see there at the Shiluach pool, and then they went up this road straight away. And on the road, you can see they've excavated the first few like little shopkeepers there, all the way on the side. And these shopkeepers would have been selling animals. They would have been selling other supplies for going into Jerusalem to be Ola Regel. But before they could do anything and go into Jerusalem to the temple, they had to go to the mikveh, which was down here in the Shiluach pool. But that was connected to the Gihon spring, which was the most important thing. So you can see a better picture of it there. There's the Gihon spring. The wiggly line there is Chizkiyahu's tunnel. The straight line is the Shiluach tunnel. There's the mikveh there, the Shiluach, and this takes you up to the Har Habayit. It goes up to Har Habayit. Okay, so they go to the Zion and they conquer this, but that is not the city of Jerusalem. That the stronghold of Zion is what then became Ir David, which is at the southeast of Jerusalem itself. And so he then says, whoever smites Vayoma David, Vayomahu, and David said on that day, Kol Makeh Yevusi, whoever smites the Jebusites, Vayiga Bet Tzinnor. Now, how did you translate that, Jeffrey? Something to do with it reaches a stronghold or something? Verse 8.
8. David declared on the day, whoever smites the Jebusites and reaches the stronghold.
Okay, reaches the stronghold. That's what you said. My translation here says reaches the tower. What do you have in Steinsaltz, Johnny? Verse 8.
It has the Tzinnor, Tzinnor.
Okay, so
it says it thinks it's to do with the water supply.
Okay, so Rav Steinsaltz is not sure, so he just gives it the Hebrew word Tzinnor.
An enigmatic term whose meaning is unclear.
Okay, so he says that's unclear. We don't have that in Jeffrey's translation or in my translation. And I'm looking in the Koren now. What does that say? So that's interesting. So the Koren translates it as a water shaft. Now, Tzinnor in modern Hebrew is what?
Yeah, it's a drainage tube.
Yeah, a pipe. A pipe. A Tzinnor is a pipe, right? A drainage tube, a pipe. Now then, what drainage pipe or what water channel are you familiar with in the ancient city of Jerusalem? You've all been there and seen it. How about this? Warren's Shaft. You heard of that? Warren's Shaft was this vertical shaft, right, like a pipe, right next to the Gihon spring. It was discovered in 1867 by Charles Warren, hence the name Warren's Shaft. But it was thought to be from well before the time of David HaMelech, in the 13th and 14th century BCE. Some say it's actually a natural shaft, others say that it was a man-made shaft. But basically, this shaft goes all the way down 13 meters, right? 13 meters down into the Gihon Spring. And so the translators like Rav Steinsaltz and the Koren and many of the Meforshim now think that this Tzinnor, this is Wikipedia I've got on the screen at the moment. Look at this here, the biblical reference. The Old Testament, 2 Samuel 5:8, that's our Pasuk, and Chronicles 11:6, which we're going to look at in a minute, states that King David conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites after Yoav had gained secret access to the walled town through a feature called in Hebrew the Tzinnor. The accuracy of this story has been questioned by some historians, of course. Some have speculated that the Tzinnor is Warren's shaft. The shaft was demonstrated to be traversable when Sergeant Birtles, a member of Warren's team, climbed up the shaft. The Hebrew word has a variety of meanings, so its interpretation as a shaft remains open to question. Others have speculated that the Tzinnor is the massive fortified passage near Gihon, built by the Canaanites as a protected access to their water supply, which is why the art scroll describes it as a stronghold, and why the Chabad describes it as a tower, because they're saying not Warren's shaft, but the protected, what do they call it? Fortress that was near Gihon, which was built to protect Gihon, because whoever rules Gihon rules Jerusalem, because that's the water supply. And that's why Chizkiyahu's tunnels were so important, because what Chizkiyahu's tunnels did was to take the water through the tunnels to the city of Jerusalem, so that if Jerusalem was put under siege, or when Jerusalem was put under siege, it still had access to the water from the Gihon spring. And that's what the incredible significance of both the Shiluach tunnel and Chizkiyahu's tunnel, because it enabled access to the Gihon spring. So to go back to our pasuk, David says in our pasuk, whoever smites the Jebusites and reaches the tower, and the pischim ve'eta avrim, the lame and the blind, sonei nefesh David, hated by the soul of David. Go on. Where's the rest of the pasuk? If I was to say to you, whoever comes to me on such and such a day, on such and such a time, I'll do X, Y, and Z. I'll give you a piece of cake. Whatever it is. Whoever does something, where's the rest of it? Doesn't make any sense, this pasuk at all. Kol makeh yivusi. Well, what will he get? Shaul said it, didn't he? Whoever will cut off Goliath's head, whoever defeat Goliath, will get. What did he get, Michael Krauss? I know you know this. Come on, remind us.
Wealth and a woman. Wealth and a daughter.
Get the king's daughter, freedom from tax, and wealth.
Lots of money.
Yeah, so he'll get something. What's it? Whoever smites the Jebusites and reaches the tower and removes the lame and the blind, no. This pasuk is defective. It's cut off in its prime. What is David saying here? Well, in order to find out, we have to go and look somewhere else. And that somewhere else is Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles, because Chronicles, of course, as we discussed last week, is actually a recap of all history. And so if we're not sure what's going on, let's go and have a look at the other chronicling of this history in Chronicles. And here it is. There we are. On the screen for you, Jeffrey, please. Verse 4 onwards.
It's not on the screen.
Oh, not on the screen?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
And David and all of Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus, and there were the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. And the inhabitants of Jebus said to David, "You shall not come here." And David captured the citadel of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said, "Whoever smites the Jebusites first will be chief and an officer." And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, ascended first and became a chief.
Stop there. So there you go. Verse 6 tells us what our Pasuk in Shmuel didn't tell us. Whoever smites the Jebusites first will be a chief and an officer. That makes sense. Our Pasuk was defective, didn't tell us what they would get. Let's just show you our Pasuk again. David said, "Whoever smites the Jebusites and reaches the tower, removes the lame and the blind, despised by the soul of David." Right, so if we compare the two, Divrei Hayamim tells us something that was missing, but there's something missing from Divrei Hayamim, from Chronicles. What's that?
The blind and the lame.
The blind and the lame, where have they gone? Right? If we're describing the same events, which clearly we are, why is Divrei Hayamim missed out the blind and the lame? And why did Shmuel Aleph miss out Yoav becoming a chief and an officer? This is very strange, no? These psukim don't make sense. So, of course, I'm not the first person to have noticed this. The Mefarshim speak about this. So first of all, there's two things that we have to really get our heads around. First of all, what's this business with the lame and the blind? Three things. What's this business with the lame and the blind? That's number one. Why is it missing from Divrei Hayamim? And why is the reward for getting to the top of the tower and smiting the Jebusites, why is that missing from our thing? So let's deal with the last one first. Why is the Yoav going up the shaft or the fortress or whatever it was and becoming the chief and the officer? Why is that missing from our chapter? Well, I think that and this is what's suggested, I think, by the Radak. Yoav at this point in time is not all that popular. Why not?
Killed Avner.
Yes, he caused David all sorts of sorrows at the end of the last chapter. Remember? Let's just go back to the last chapter, chapter 4. Okay, well, actually, I think it was chapter 3. Yeah, it was chapter 3, not chapter 4. Chapter 3. What happened in chapter 3? Avner comes along and says, "I want to make you king out of all Israel." And Yoav's not having it. Yoav goes after him, and Yoav kills him. And what does David have to do over here? He says to them, "Rend your clothes, gird yourselves with sackcloth, and wail before Avner." He has to make himself into a right performance of mourning Avner to keep the people of Israel on board. And that was all because Yoav was a hothead, right? And we know he was a hothead because they were all hotheads, all three of them, three brothers. Yoav, who were the other two? Yoav, Avishai, and who was the third one that Avner killed?
No.
Asahel. So and David says later on, "These sons of Zeruiah have caused me trouble." It's probably why they were called Zeruiah, from Soros. They were bad news. They were trouble. So if we go back to our chapter 5, the last thing we want to do here is to make Yoav into a big knacker, because Yoav's in the doghouse at the moment in the chronology. So conveniently, chapter 5 of Shmuel Aleph misses out the fact that it was that David gave a reward for whoever will go. And not surprisingly, it was Yoav that did it, because Yoav was one of the sons of Zeruiah who were hotheads. There's only a hothead that's going to go and be the Nachshon ben Aminodov, if you like, to go and jump in first and go and do it. So he goes up there, according to Chronicles, and then of course we do know later on, as we go on, think that Yoav does become and is the chief officer of David. But right at this moment, it does not fit the story to tell us that. And so the Tanakh sort of hides it. It sort of, it says, oh, we don't need to go into that right now. So that's, I think, explains why that bit is missing. We still have not explained what the lame and the blind are all about and why is it missing from Divrei Yamim. So let's have a look at that. There are basically two different approaches to the blind and the lame. The one approach is that which Johnny alluded to in the Steinsaltz, based on a Rashi, and he says like this, that the Yevusim were the descendants of a famous person in Tanakh, in the Torah, in fact. Anybody know who it was?
Abimelech.
Israel.
Abimelech is correct, Hannah. How did you know that?
Schottenstein says so.
Who says?
Schottenstein.
Schottenstein. Okay, right. Yes, you're right. Abimelech. And who was Abimelech, Hannah?
He was the king of the Canaanites when in Abraham's time.
Yes.
And Abraham made a pact with him.
Correct. Abraham made a pact with Abimelech.
And he was later punished for it.
He had a pact with Abimelech. Abimelech was somebody who was there at the time, king at the time of Abraham. And apparently they had two idols this is according to Rashi, they had two idols at the entrance to Jerusalem. Of course, they used the idols. We call them idols, but what did they call them?
Gods.
Gods. And what do gods have?
Weapons.
Yeah.
Power. Yeah, they have power. So they put their two gods, in their eyes, powerful gods, at the entrance to the city. One was lame and one was blind. And so what? What was so special about this blind and lame, one blind and one lame idol, that they were so confident in the power of these gods that David Melech Yisrael, who was an upcoming star, and they must have heard about, they were so confident that they were not going to get beaten by him. What was so special? Who were this blind and lame idol modeled upon? Anybody know? You won't know without looking in some Perush, because it's obscure. But go on, Peter.
The thing that I remember something about the reference to blind could be Yitzchak and the lame could be Yaakov because of
Very good, excellent. That is exactly what Rashi says. Rashi says that these idols, these gods with the small g, were modeled upon Yitzchak, who was blind. How do we know Yitzchak was blind?
Because he got mixed up between Esav and Yaakov.
We're told very clearly.
His eyes were dimmed.
Yeah.
His eyes were dimmed. Yeah, he was blind. And what about Jacob? He was lame. How do we know he was lame?
The wrestling
From the idol.
Gidanosha. That's right. Gidanosha. He had sciatica, and he was lame. Anybody here had sciatica? Bloody hurts. Makes you limp. Makes you lame. So they were very confident. Why were they so confident? Because these gods of theirs were modeled on the Avot, on Yitzchak, well, basically on all three of them. Abraham, who was a pal of Avimelech's, Yitzchak the blind, and Yaakov the lame. So what they were saying, in effect, when they said, you shall not come here unless you remove the blind and the lame, they were saying is, you will not be successful here because I know that you will not destroy these gods, this lame and blind, because they're your fathers. Your whole people is based upon these folk. So you're not going to come and destroy them. Or alternatively, they will not allow you to destroy them because they have the power of gods. So they were very confident, these Yevusim. And they said, and that's why it says here in verse 6, Lamor, it's as if to say, Lo yavo David heina. There's no way David's getting in here because we've got the Avot on our side, as it were. Okay.
Rabbi Steinsaltz puts it nicely, Johnny. He said, our city is so heavily protected that even the lame and the blind guards could resist you.
Okay, so that's the second approach.
Yeah, it's nicely put.
The first approach was Rashi's approach. The second approach, which is the Ibn Ezra, says that they were nothing to do with Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov, but they were so confident of their strength that who did they post as guards? Normally you want your guards to be, strong fellow. If you go to a nightclub, right? I'm sure you've all been to a nightclub at one point or another in your checkered pasts. I know I have. And I know Jeffrey has because he took me there once. But we won't go into that. But you go to one of these places, and who do you have on the door? Who are the guards? Bouncers, big stackers, right? You wouldn't have somebody who was blind or somebody who was lame. No, you'd have big stackers there. So they were so confident that who did they have as their guards? They were so confident that they could put useless guards on, blind and lame guards. They were so strong. We're so confident, David, that you will not come in here, that we don't need stackers on the gate. Or we can make do with blind and lame people, right? And we're not frightened of you at all. And in a way, they were taunting David. They were taunting him, saying, "You've no chance. My 3-year-old grandson could beat you." Right? That's basically what they're saying. They're not interested in his strength, and they're very confident in their own strength. That's the Ibn Ezra's approach. Josephus, apparently, when he writes, he takes that approach, and he says that they stationed blind and lame people to defend the city, and it was a mockery to David. The only problem with that is it doesn't tell us why they were so confident. David had a great reputation. What did they speak about David with regard to the Pelishtim, to the Philistines? What did they say about David?
And he killed 10,000.
Yeah, he killed 10,000. You wouldn't be confident. He'd also killed who?
Goliath.
He had a good reputation. From where did the Jebusites get this supreme confidence to say we're very confident, we're strong?
Schottenstein says that Benjamin had tried to capture the city and they hadn't succeeded, and they'd made an arrangement with them that they would live together peaceably with the Jebusites because they couldn't conquer them.
Okay, so we spoke about this last week, if you remember, and I showed you 2 psukim, one from Shoftim and one from Yehoshua. The one from Yehoshua says exactly what Hannah has just said, that the Jebusites the Binyamin tribe of Binyamin tried to conquer Yerushalayim, the Jebusites, and couldn't. And then the next place in Shoftim later on says the tribe of Yehuda did exactly the same thing, and they couldn't do it. But that was before the time of David. So the question still remains: Yes, they had been strong in the past, but David was the upcoming star, and it turns out that their supreme confidence was actually misplaced, because David did conquer Jerusalem, and he conquered Jerusalem. If we go back to Divrei Hayamim, let's just go back to Divrei. Dave, Jeffrey, if you could carry on read it for us.
And David dwelt in the citadel, therefore they called it the city of David. And he built the city from around, from the Millo until the surrounding area. And Joab restored the rest of the city. And David waxed constantly greater, and the Lord of hosts was with him.
David waxed constantly greater, and the Lord of hosts was with him. Vayelech David haloch v'gadol. Haloch v'gadol. Where have we heard that expression before? Who else was described as haloch v'gadol?
God, I would think.
No, well, probably. But David?
Wasn't it Yitzchak?
It was Yitzchak, yes, correct. Yitzchak was described as haloch v'gadol, getting greater. And this was after Yitzchak had done his negotiations with the Be'erot, etc. He's described as haloch v'gadol. So let's have a look at our pasuk. Now then, we're back in chapter 5, Jeffrey. We're back in chapter 5 of Shmuel, from verse 9 onwards, please.
David settled in the fortress and called it the city of David. David built around the city from Millo and inward. David kept becoming greater, and Hashem, the God of legions, was with him.
Got there. Pasuk Yud on the right-hand side of the screen. Vayelech David haloch v'gadol v'Hashem Elokei Tzavaot imo. Divrei Hayamim. Vayelech David haloch v'gadol v'Hashem Tzavaot imo. Same pasuk, exactly the same pasuk, word for word. David grew steadily greater, and Hashem was with him. So,
have I missed something? Why it doesn't mention idols in this pasuk, this part, and the other one doesn't? You know, the two differences, two pasukim.
Why? So why we have? Yeah. So we haven't answered that question yet. You're right.
Okay, I'm not missing it. Right, okay.
No, you didn't miss it. Divrei Hayamim. We don't have the lame and the
blind. Yeah.
And the blind. So why don't we have the lame?
One they don't have about what's his name?
Yoav.
Yoav, yeah.
Yeah. So we explained why we don't have Yoav in Shmuel, because he was persona non grata for the time being. He was in the doghouse.
Right.
But why don't we have the lame and the blind in Divrei Hayamim? It's quite simply because it's the Divrei Hayamim is the condensed version in a way, which is trying to tell us what this is trying to tell us is that David was consolidating his kingdom, expanding his kingdom, and was becoming great. That's the point of Divrei Hayamim at this point. And he confides, what's the word? Suffices to say in verse 5 that they said to him, "You'll not come here," and he captured it, and that's it. End of. Right? These little details of the blind and the lame, it would, in a way, detract from the point that Divrei Hayamim was trying to make. And the difference, what we need to understand is the two places have got a different purpose. Divrei Hayamim's purpose is literally that, chronicles. It's a history book. It's to give us the history in chronological order of what went on. Whereas our story in Shmuel, it's happening contemporaneously as we're reading it. So we need to know all the details. It's a much more detailed and nuanced account. Whereas the Divrei Hayamim account is the condensed version so that we know what happened. You understand?
Okay.
It's a difference in in the purpose of the two books. Okay. Yes, Jeffrey, you wanted to say something?
I was going to say that it mentions here that David detests. And we know that he detested paganism. That we've heard before. So
that's a very good point that you make, because let's just read verse 8. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think I might have forgotten to mention it otherwise. Whoever smites the Jebusites and reaches the tower and removes the lame and the blind, despised by the soul of David. Why would David despise the lame and the blind?
Because they're idols.
Okay, because they're idols. But we don't know they're idols, do we? Because that's a Rashi. Just from the Pasuk, what does it mean? It means the lame and the blind.
Yeah.
So why would David despise the lame and the blind? Correct.
Because
Correct.
he knew they were idols.
Correct. Because he doesn't despise the blind and the lame. You didn't know the answer to that because it was a trick question. Because David would not despise the lame and the blind. Why would David not despise the lame and the blind?
Well, they pose no threat to him.
Apart from that, you're right. But apart from that,
he had them in his family.
He did. Correct. Who did he have, Peter? Who was lame?
Mephibosheth.
Mephibosheth. And where did we see about Mephibosheth? In the last chapter, chapter 4, we had this very strange pasuk in the middle of everything, which told us, which was in a completely peculiar place. On the screen, please, Jeffrey, verse 4.
And Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse carried him and fled. And it was in her haste to flee that he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth.
Yeah, so he's got him in his family. And what we find later on, we don't know it at this point, but what we do know, because we've read on in later chapters, is that actually David looks after Mephibosheth. So we know that he doesn't despise the lame and the blind. That's a very good point, Peter. Another reason why he doesn't despise the lame and the blind, actual lame and blind people, because the Torah tells us, what does the Torah tell us? It tells us, 36 times it tells us one way or another that you should look after the vulnerable, the stranger, the widow, the orphan, anybody who's vulnerable. And that includes the blind and the lame.
You shouldn't put the obstacles in front of the blind, I think.
Correct. Yes, Hannah.
Also, doesn't he take in Eviatar after Nov when he's left as an orphan with all on his own?
David is definitely not a despiser of the weak, the lame, and the blind. So you have, and I think that's probably one of the supports that the opinion that is put forward by Rashi, at least, that these were idols, is that the only way, and Jeffrey said it, the only way that David would despise the lame and the blind were as if that was a reference to the idols. And he despised them because what had they effectively done is they had taken his ancestors, the Avot, and contaminated them, bastardized them into false gods. And of course David would despise such a thing. So that, I think, is the source for the opinion that says that these were idols based upon Yitzchak and Yaakov, the blind and the lame. Although verse 8 is not complete because it misses out the Yoav bit, it does tell us about the lame and the blind. It does not mention that in Divrei Hayamim because it's not relevant to Divrei Hayamim's point, which is to give us the history. And then despised by the soul of David, I think tells us very clearly what we're dealing with. He did not despise the lame and the blind. On the contrary, David was very caring of those. And so he grew steadily greater, and the Lord of the hosts was with him. Now, this is in some ways a bit of a summary chapter, because what we're going to read next in this chapter actually happened much later. This next bit in this chapter is, if you like, a summary of what went on later on, put here on the back of verse 10. Verse 10 again for us, Jeffrey.
David kept becoming greater, and Hashem, the God of legions, was with him.
So now that we know that David grew steadily greater and Hashem was with him, the rest of this chapter is going to tell us things that support that view that David grew strong and that he consolidated his kingdom and he expanded his kingdom and he became very great. Later on, in next chapters, we'll go back and we'll see that what he reports here, what the author reports here in verses 11 onwards, actually verses 11 to 16 are actually in brackets, should be in brackets because they happened later on. Really, we should go from verse 2, really, or verse 3. We should go from verse 3 straight to verse 17. Let's just do that and read verse 3 and then verse 17, one after the other, and you'll see how it flows. Do that for us, Jeffrey. Read verse 3 and then 17.
All the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David sealed a covenant with them in Hebron before Hashem, and they anointed David as king over Israel. The Philistines heard that, in brackets, all the tribes had anointed David as king over Israel. So all the Philistines came up to seek out David. David heard and went down to the fortress.
Stop there. Now that makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you read verse 3 and verse 17, one second, Hannah. If you read verse 3 and verse 17 consecutively, it makes sense. It says they all anointed David, and then when the Philistines heard that they'd anointed David, they went and tried to attack David. So all the rest of it, from verse 4 to verse 16, is actually things that went on at a later date out of order, but they're put here in order to give us the idea and to consolidate the kingdom of David, to give us the feeling that David has consolidated his kingdom. Although actually these things went on later on. Yes, Hannah, what did you want to say?
Except you don't know, first of all, you don't know where the fortress is, because the fortress is obviously the fortress they're talking about in Jerusalem, in Zion. And secondly, it says in 18 that they came to the valley of Rephaim. Emek Rephaim is in Jerusalem.
Okay.
So,
right.
if you take out all the verses of him conquering Jerusalem,
let me stop you there, because we are going to deal with that next week. Actually, Emek Rephaim is not in Jerusalem. Emek Rephaim is a street in Jerusalem today. But if you want to know where Emek Rephaim is, I will show you where Emek Rephaim. There is Emek Rephaim on the screen for you. The valley of Rephaim over here. And it is actually outside of Jerusalem. It runs between Jerusalem and going west. So, but we'll come to that next week. I got it already.
Isn't Emek Rephaim where the monastery is there in the valley in Jerusalem? Just before
no, that's not Emek Rephaim. I think that's Emek Kidron. But Emek Rephaim is on the other side. We'll come to it next week, Hannah, because I want to do the verses in between. I just wanted to show you for the time being that verses 3 and 17 should be read consecutively, but the in-between stuff is put there to give us the perception, the correct perception that David became stronger and stronger, although this is out of chronological order. Yes, Jeffrey?
There is a footnote in Art Scroll which says the Milo was a landfill, an open plaza for large gatherings, or a moat.
Right.
I've not heard of that before, and I was thinking, what they're talking about.
So that would be probably the area between Ir David and Jerusalem itself. So it may well be referring to the Shiluach channel, which was a moat of some description. So it may be referring to that. Right, so let's just go back now and look at these things in these psukim, because they're there, so we have to read them, even though they refer to later on. How do I know they refer to things that are later on? Well, you'll see it's dead obvious as we get to verse 13 onwards. So verse 11, Jeffrey.
Hiram, king of Tyre, sent a delegation to David with cedar wood and carpenters and masons of wall stones, and they built a palace for David. David realized that Hashem had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel.
Okay, stop there. Who was this Hiram, king of Tyre? Hiram Melech Tzor. Who was he?
I think he was a distant mishpacha. I think he was some sort of descendant of the guy that helped to build the Mishkan coming out of Egypt. I may be wrong, but I seem to.
I think you've got things a little bit mixed up, but you're not entirely mixed up, because Hiram is mentioned later on.
Yeah, with Shlomo.
Not with the building of the Mishkan, but with the building of the Bet HaMikdash. When Shlomo, son of David, builds the Bet HaMikdash, Hiram, he calls to Hiram to send him cedar wood and craftsmen. So you're right; it's to do with the building, but not of the Mishkan, but of the Bet HaMikdash. Now, if we just stop there before I come back to you, Jeffrey, if Hiram was involved with the building of the Bet HaMikdash, which was much later on, how long did David reign?
33 years in Jerusalem.
40 altogether, 33 years in Jerusalem. And if you work it out, Hiram would have had to have been, if it was the same person, Hiram would have had to have been on the throne for 64 years, it works out, which is unheard of in those days. And so the Mefarshim all say that this business of sending David messengers and cedar trees and everything else was much later on, when David had already established himself as a superpower in the area. And that's why that's why I say here that this was events that happened later on. Now, we can see very clearly in verses 13 to 16 that that's the case. Just read it very quickly for us, Jeffrey.
David took additional concubines and wives from Jerusalem after his coming from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. These are the names of those born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Natan, Shlomo, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet.
Okay, so all of these people were born much, much later, but we're told about their birth here, because what are the two things that a successful king has?
Wives and children.
Wives and children, and
Horses.
and a palace, right? A palace. A successful king has a big palace and a big dynasty. And that is what we're hearing. Verse 10 says, David grew steadily greater, and Hashem was with him, brackets. And I'll tell you why, or I'll tell you how I know, because King Hiram of Tyre, who was a big knacker with big cedar trees and lots of big craftsmen, he sent stuff down to David. So David must have been a knacker. And I'll tell you something else, says the thing. He had a big dynasty. He had concubines and wives and kids. And look at all these kids he had. That is how we know that he was growing steadily greater. Now, when we come to verse 17, we're going back to the chronological story of what happened when David was anointed as king of all Israel, before King Hiram sends him messengers with all sorts of stuff, and before he takes concubines and wives and has kids. He's busy before all of that with the Pelishtim, which we will deal with next week. We'll deal with the Pelishtim next week. We'll deal with Emek Rephaim next week. And it's a good place to stop there. Yeah, Jeffrey, what did you want to say?
I've forgotten now. Sorry. There's so many things going on now.
So let's just recap what we've said today then, which will help me for starting next week. We've said that we dealt with this week the differences between Shmuel Bet Chapter 5 and Divrei Hayamim Chapter 11. The fact that the lame and the blind are not mentioned in Divrei Hayamim, and Yoav is not mentioned here in chapter 5. We've mentioned this Tzinnor, which many people think is Warren's shaft, which is, I think, is absolutely cool as anything. And we dealt with the idea of the lame and the blind possibly being idols based on Yitzchak and Yaakov, and that's why David despised them, because David certainly did not despise lame and blind people for being lame and blind. On the contrary, he was very careful to be good to them. And we dealt with the idea that David became stronger, and that verses 11 to 16 are in brackets to show us how strong he eventually became. And then next week we'll begin chapter 5, verse 17, with the battle of the Pelishtim from Emek Rephaim. Okay, any questions on what we've done today so far? No? Jolly good. Right, Shavua Tov.
So,
I'll just stop.
Thank you.